Nobody needs to introduce the Nile. For years, the world's longest river was the most famous. At 6650 kilometers, 4132 miles, the Amazon River of South America recently disputed this claim. It has been difficult to tell which is longest from the estuary to the distant source due to their coincidence in length. Due to its length in the Sahara Desert, which supplies little rainfall, the Nile has a comparatively low flow compared to the Amazon. Instead, the desert heat evaporates water from the river. Despite its importance in world history, its source was unknown until recently, and its peculiar flood timing puzzled the ancients. Nile derives from the Latin Nilus, which is said to have arisen from the Semitic Nahal, meaning valley. The ancient Egyptians called the river R/R, meaning black, because the sediments brought down the river were dark compared to the desert's pale sands. Nile Delta. Our voyage begins at its finish, the Mediterranean Sea flowing. Nile Delta. Strabo described 7 main branches in the 1st century, but the flow has subsequently been diverted to 2. Herodotus of the 5th century BC, who described its characteristic triangular shape, coining the geographical name delta, since the Greek letter is triangular. Much of the Nile sediment, up to 20 meters 75 feet deep, forms Africa's most productive soil here. Egypt's 100 million plus inhabitants are mostly limited to the delta and floodplain of the Nile since the country receives so little rain. The Nile is a major transit route for commodities and people. The Egyptian Nile. The Nile flows across Egypt and northern Sudan. Cataracts occur throughout the river's course, starting where Aswan Dam is today. Dam details later. During the summer peak, the seasonal river Atbara joins the Nile in northern Sudan and accounts for 1/5 of its flow. However, Sudan's capital, Khartoum, is where the 2 main tributaries join the Nile downstream. Blue and White Niles meet here. The 2 Niles are named for their distinct colors from the geology they cross on their long journeys. Blue Nile, Ethiopia. Despite its shorter length, the Blue Nile contributes the most downstream flow annually, reaching 70% of summer peak flow. The Blue Nile descends from the Ethiopian highlands at 2,000 meters 6,000 feet through huge canyons, over 1,000 meters 4,000 feet. Summer rains in Ethiopia cause the Nile to flood annually. The Egyptian flood peaks in September and October because the water surge takes time to reach downstream. White Nile, Sud. The White Nile and its tributaries flow more steadily despite being longer. At its lowest point in April/May, it produces 80% of the overall Nile flow, whereas in August, the Blue Nile delivers 10%. The White Nile finishes at South Sudan's Sud wetland. The river splits into hundreds of channels across tens of thousands of square kilometers due to the flat topography. The vegetation that chokes the several streams in the swamp inhibits navigation. Lake Victoria, Uganda. Nile source. After the Sud, the Mountain Nile, or Al Jabal River, rises over rapids to Lake Albert on the Uganda-Congo border. Since Lake Victoria, the world's 2nd largest freshwater lake, feeds its last major portion, the river is called the Victoria Nile from Lake Albert. The Nile ends with this lake because of the lake's immense size and the fact that several rivers feed it, none of which stand out in length or flow. The most distant source of the Nile's waters is still unknown, but a recent inquiry suggests Burundi's Kajrat and Ruvumu River headwaters. The Nile source search. The source of the Nile in the East African highlands was a mystery. Foreigners in ancient, medieval, and subsequent times. Astonishingly, the Nile's source was only recorded 160 years ago, given its importance. Ancient Egypt and Nile. Nile waters and black sediments may have been the first agricultural irrigation. Egypt was unusual in the Mediterranean because of its year-round water supply, heat, and sunlight, which allowed intense agriculture. In late July, these rivers inundated, spreading rich deposits. This contradicted the ancient Greek and Roman experience of all other rivers flooding in winter as Mediterranean peak rains come in the milder season. We now know that the monsoonal rain pattern over Ethiopia's Blue Nile headwaters, which in contrast to the Mediterranean, received the majority of their rain in the summer, was what caused this summer's Nile flood. Nile in the Bible. The book of Exodus describes how the Nile carried Moses in a basket of reeds. After the 10 plagues, Pharaoh yielded, and Moses led the Israelites out of Egypt. Ancient Nubia and Nile. According to certain theories, the ancient Egyptians knew the Nile up to Khartoum and possibly as far as Lake Tana in Ethiopia up the Blue Nile. The Kushites, the most successful kingdom in Nubia, reached a height in the 8th century BC and existed until the end of antiquity, with their capital of Meroe on the Nile, north of Khartoum. Romans in the Nile, 66 AD expedition. The Roman Empire invaded Egypt in 30 BC as the last Mediterranean country, seeing it as the most fruitful thanks to the Nile. Due to its abundant crops, Egypt became the empire's breadbasket, while the Nile, which originates in East Africa, fed most of the Roman Empire. Many Romans, including Nero, stressed the source of these vital springs. He sent an expedition up the Nile to identify its source in 66 AD. Pliny and Seneca wrote about this journey. They agree that the weed-choked Sud channels slowed the expedition, but there is a curious reference to a waterfall flowing through two pillars to the south, which would suggest that they had crossed the Stud's flatlands into the mountain Nile. It's more likely that they'd heard tales of such geography from those they met or invented them. Mountains of the Moon. Ptolemy, the famous Egyptian geographer, reported the Nile's source as being in the Mountains of the Moon in 150 AD, possibly based on Diogenes' assertion that he found it in a series of lakes among snowy peaks. Geographers will recognize these as the Rwenzori Mountains on the Uganda-Congo border, near the Nile's current sources. If not for Ptolemy's Mountains of the Moon, an imagined chain of mountains going west from Ethiopia across Sudan, which don't exist because Sudan is flat, this would be exciting. The source of the Nile was viewed this way for 17 centuries. British Nile source discovery. The British Empire expanded into Africa in the 1800s. Egypt, Sudan, and Kenya had fallen to the British at various points in this century, and the Royal Geographic Society of London saw that this may ultimately resolve the source of the Nile through journeys into the terra incognita of the Dark Continent. In 1858, John Hanning Speke and Richard Burton were the first Europeans to visit Lake Victoria, going up from Zanzibar instead of down the Nile through the Sud. Both explorers claimed to have confirmed Lake Victoria as the Nile's source and thereafter had a public fight. However, Speke, without Burton, accurately identified the Nile exit on the northern shore of Lake Victoria in 1862. Linking the famous river and lake, Lake Victoria is fed by multiple headwaters, and many trips have been attempted since Speke to discover the farthest source, with the Kagera and Ruvubu rivers in Burundi being the likely sources. Most believe Lake Victoria had solved the longest-running geographical riddle, the source of the Nile. Aswan and Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dams. In 1960, southern Egypt began building the Aswan High Dam, which had the greatest impact on the Nile. Too much water downstream caused deadly floods, while too little caused poor harvests and hunger. The dam's principal aim was to manage water flow. After its completion in 1970, Lake Nasser upstream of the dam absorbed the seasonal Blue Nile flow, ending millennia of annual floods in Egypt. Due to evaporation in the Sahara Desert, the lake loses 10 to 30% of its water annually. Hydroelectric turbines at the dam generate 2 GW of power. Ethiopia is filling a larger Blue Nile dam, causing tensions with Egypt. In 2011, construction began on the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, which will deliver 5 GW of power to Ethiopia and boost its economy. Egypt has delayed dam building and claimed it will restrict downstream flow by disrupting foreign finance. It is unclear how this would apply after filling, but it is true during filling. This greatest of rivers, spanning millennia of recorded history, writes a new page of history with a dam that could transform the country, which rains once produced that seasonal floods so far downstream, which led to the development of that great civilization and prompted questions about its distant source. From the ancient mysteries of its source to modern-day geopolitical tensions, the Nile River continues to shape history as it winds through Africa. From the majestic heights of Lake Victoria to the intricate deltas of Egypt, the Nile's journey is a testament to nature's power and humanity's relentless pursuit of knowledge. Join us on this extraordinary voyage, where every bed of the Nile reveals a story of civilization, innovation, and the enduring quest to unravel its ancient secrets. Like, share, and subscribe to stay tuned for more explorations into the world's most iconic waterway.